So we are here at the OpenIoT Summit, and today we have with us, our own legend, Jonathan. I know you very well. I've been following you forever, since I have been into the Linux journalistic world. But just for the sake of our readers and viewers, can you quickly, tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, I'm Jonathan Corbet. I'm the founder and executive editor of LWN.net, which just celebrated its 20th anniversary a couple of months ago. I am also the author of Linux Device Drivers, co-author of that, and the Linux kernel documentation maintainer.
How did LWN exist, why did you create it?
I've often asked myself that, actually. We actually started many years ago in the mid-90s thinking that Linux was going to go somewhere and wanted to be part of it. I had what was becoming a middle management job in a national research institution at that point. Had been using it since about 1993. And so we figured we would start a consulting company around Linux. We didn't really have all that firm an idea of exactly what we were going to be consulted on. But we figured that while we were starting that, we would create this little newsletter to make use of the energy we were already putting into keeping up with the Linux development community and make it available to the world as a whole and to attract attention to ourselves. We thought that nobody else could really keep up with it. It was moving so fast at the time. There were, 100 messages a day on Linux kernel, and nobody could even handle that. Now it's over 1,000.
I made a mistake only once and subscribed to it.
Yeah, don't do that.
After that, I learned my lesson. So
anyway, the consulting business didn't really take off very well, despite we tried a few different things, and never got that far with it. But the newsletter did. And so in the end, we decided that somebody was telling us that was the direction we needed to go. And so we put our energy fully into that.
Mm-hmm. And as you also mentioned, that if you mailing list has so many messages going on, how do you track, or how you used to track, what is going on?
The main thing that we do is we follow mailing lists, to tell the truth. That's where a lot of the activity is. So I probably follow in the order of 100 mailing lists.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. So you have minions around you? They just filter everything?
I wish. I wish. I've been looking to hire minions, if we can find the right minions. But no, I use a newsreader. I use GNews, which is a really good way to blast through a lot of material very quickly. And so I've learned how to scan things very quickly and to find topics that are interesting, and I kind of set them aside and watch them develop and try to keep a handle on what's happening in the community that way.
Right. And what is that status? Because at one point I think you were planning, thinking of shutting it down, but it got awesome support from the community. So what happened?
Well, we had for some time been functioning as an advertising supported newsletter, and that worked for a little while in the .com era. And then we got acquired and we let someone else worry about it for a while. And then the .com era ended and we got unacquired. And really the friendliest sort of way, they gave it back to us of all things. And we tried to continue this advertising model for a bit. And that just never worked very well for us. And especially in 2001, 2002, it wasn't working well for anybody. And so we finally reached a point where we said, this isn't working. We asked for donations, got a few $1,000s, which doesn't get you very far. And finally had to tell our community this just isn't working. We're going to have to shut it down. And then a lot of people, well, first of all, they sent us a whole bunch of money in relative terms saying, thanks for what you did so far. And they said, why don't you consider the subscription model? I would buy a subscription if you did that. And so we decided to give it one last try as a result of that. And it worked. It worked. It's not always been the richest of living, but it has functioned quite well. And I think is really the best model for a publication like ours. I'm glad we did it.
And is it sustainable now?
It is. It is sustainable, yeah. In that we have, over 100 companies subscribing their employees and a vast number of individual subscribers. Right. And so, financially it works really well at this point.
Right. And as since you have been in the industry for so long, Linux has also, I think 27 years. Linux has been around for 27 years, something
like that, yeah.
Even more than that. now I think Linux set the stage for all the other open source projects to, like Kubernetes or whatever, they get adopted. One thing that I have noticed and I wanted to ask you was that Linux took a lot of time, to succeed, to get. But when you think about Kubernetes or OpenStack, they get adopted, embraced very quickly. Is it because of the Linux's success, or is it because these projects are designed to kind of become part of the commercial world, from the day one?
It may be some of both, but it just took the world a long time to come around to the idea of open software development. The X Consortium, the MIT X Consortium, kind of blazed that trail in a lot of ways. It was out there doing what we would now recognize as open source before Linux was ever released. Linux, I think, really brought attention to the idea that this can work and that it can produce top quality software. And so, nobody questions that idea anymore, whereas certainly back in, say, 1983, when Richard Stallman said, I'm going to create a free operating system, most of us just said, that's a great idea, I'd love to have that, but you'll never get there.
Right.
You can't do that. But now, nobody questions that you can do this. And so there's a whole set of barriers that don't need to be overcome now. We have a whole lot of structure around it for doing distributed development that we didn't have back in those days. And we didn't really, the rise of Linux corresponds to a great extent with the rise of the internet, right? Without the internet, it was much harder to do this. And so now we have tools like Git and a whole lot of other things. We have a whole set of procedures. So it's natural that a free software project would come up much more quickly now if it's going to be successful.
Right. But we have also seen that a lot of community-driven projects, they are still struggling, whereas I don't want to name anyone, but at the same time, you see commercialized projects which are heavily successful. So I think that also plays some role. As sustainability is very important,
I think that plays a role, and I think we certainly see examples of companies seeing free software, open source, as a way that they can maybe try to offload some of the development and maintenance work of their software. And so they try to establish a project that looks like a free software project, but is still very much under their control.
Right, okay.
And, that works, it's still free software. But I think it's not the only way to make a successful project. And certainly in a number of commercial free software projects also languish. You need to have something more than just commercial support.
Yeah, that's right. But you mentioned, that some companies, how do you really distinguish between, okay, this is a project which is actually a pseudo open source project. What are the certain criteria that one should look at, that whether it's a company controlled project, a pseudo open source project, or it's really, okay, it was started by a company, but it's a fully open source project?
Oh, I don't know that there's a set of hard and set rules. Certainly you would look at the governance of the project and how are decisions made regarding the direction of the project. So, if it's very firmly under the corporate grasp, then you have to wonder how free it really is.
Right.
I would personally look for the presence of copyright assignment agreements. If all of the code has to actually be handed over to the company to their ownership, that certainly makes a project less free and can make it easy for them to turn proprietary and harder for others to fork.
Because I recall my discussion with Jim Whitehurst, the CEO of Red Hat, and he was like, don't get, fooled by the word open source, because a lot of companies, they whitewash this word, but there are still a lot of things you have to be careful about when you're looking at it. So let's just switch topic for a while and talk about, some hardcore work, other than the philosophy. You also release a report, I think, on a yearly basis, Linux kernel report, right?
Yes.
In association with Linux. What is this report all about?
The report that we released through the Linux Foundation really it's a look at where the code for the kernel is coming from. Who is working on developing the kernel? What is the pace of the work that they are doing, and which companies are supporting that work? It comes from some work that Greg Crow-Hartman and I kind of did independently many years ago when we first got into this, just wondering what the story was there. I know that on my side, I was knowing that a lot of people working on the kernel were doing this as part of their jobs, And we could kind of see, once we actually had a real source code management system, who was contributing code. But we didn't really know who was supporting this work.
Okay.
And so about 2620, I think, is when I first wrote a report in LWN, where I wrote a set of scripts to pull the information out of the Git repository, try to associate every contribution with an employer if I could, and see which employers were supporting the work on the kernel. And it created a bit of a stir at the time because it was a surprise to everybody, including me, because there was still this image of free software in general, and Linux in particular, as being something produced by kids who haven't moved out of their parents' basements, right? That sort of thing. And what I found at the time was that I could identify about 70% of the code going into the kernel was the work of professional developers working for somebody to do that, right? Since then, things have changed, our numbers have gotten better and so on, and that number is actually something over 90% at this point.
So 90% is funded by commercial entities?
Yes,
yeah,
at least.
That trend has been good. Is it because more people are now encouraged to use the official email IDs, or is it because there is really more people are getting paid to get the work done?
Well, with regard to email IDs, we do a whole lot of stuff to...
Yeah, so how do you really track that, if this is employee or, commercial funded or...
Well, because we know who's working where much of the time, and
That's true, yeah.
Sometimes people will contact us and say, hey, my employer wants to make sure that my work is credited to them, because people actually look at this stuff. And sometimes we simply ask them, hey, who are you working for?
Okay.
And
so it's not just scanning the data, and it's you actually interact with people to get more in depth.
Yeah, we actually talk to the people, and we'll map private email addresses onto corporate support.
So do you still work with Greg on this, or you do work?
We do it together. We have a database essentially where people are working, and we maintain that together.
Okay. And what are the, in addition to that, there are more and more, paid developers. What are the trends you have seen over the years?
One of the biggest trends that I've been watching over the years is the decrease in the number of developers who we know are not actually working for somebody, we know are working on their own time.
Okay.
That went from about 15% that we knew back around 2620, which is better part of 10 years or so ago at this point, down to closer to 5 or 6% now of work that we know is coming from volunteers. And there were times when we have worried about this because volunteers are often the people who are our next round of paid developers, right? That's often how you get into the community, is by doing a little bit of stuff on your own time. And there is some truth to that, although I did a bunch of cranking to see the employment status of people when they submitted their very first patch, or actually when they got their very first patch merged, and found that actually at this point most people are already working for somebody when they get their first patch in. So volunteers are much less a source of our developers than they used to be. But I think the other reason we see this is that people tend not to remain volunteers for long, because if they show any kind of history of getting code in the kernel, they tend to be approached by people and offered jobs.
So that also means that the best way to get a job is to become an active contributor on the mailing list and GitHubs.
I believe that is true for a wide range of projects, not just the kernel.
Right. Any other trend? One thing that we kept hearing is that the top maintainers, they're getting older and older. So have you seen any trend? I don't know if you're tracking age, that whether our Linux community is getting any younger, or we still have the same people. They're the same people I know.
If you look at the top maintainers, there are certainly a whole lot of people who were there in the early 90s or mid 90s. So in a sense, the upper cadre is definitely getting a little bit older and a little bit grayer. There is some truth to that, and I think the concerns of that are not entirely overblown. Essentially, there's a whole bunch of us who managed to stumble into something good back in the 1990s, and we've stuck with it ever since because, well, it's been a great ride, right? It's still a very interesting thing to be a part of.
It's getting better and better, every day. So,
on the other hand, you do see people coming in. There's in any given kernel release, right? We do a release about every 10 weeks. In any given release, there are about 200 developers who submit their first patches to that release. So we're bringing a lot of people into the community. Maybe half of those 200 never put in something again. They had one thing they wanted to fix, they fixed it, and then they move on. But some of them stick around and become long-term parts of our community, and some of those work their way into subsystem maintainer positions, and will be there in the future as other people retire.
Right, and also it's I don't know how complicated it is to actually graduate to that level. You do have to have develop skill set over years. You cannot just like write 2 PHP patches and you are become a PHP developer. Because kernel, you have to know so many lower level stuff to become.
You have to work your way into it a little bit, but there are plenty of people who are doing so, and I'm not really worried about the future of our community because we are doing so well at attracting new developers. We have an influx rate that any other project would just love to have.
Okay, you're not. But is there any concern that you are worried? Like when I talk to Greg, Greg always say that only thing I'm worried about is that we might screw something up, So we are worried about ourselves. We may make. So what is everything is going good, everything looks good. But do you have any concern that you think, that could be a risky or dangerous situation? What concerns you?
I have quite a few of them, and I gave a whole talk about it last year that I called the kernel's limits to growth, about where I think things could go wrong. I believe that we're showing increasing signs of stress at the maintainer level, that the number of maintainers is not scaling with the number of developers, and so each maintainer is having to deal with more and more work coming through them. And I'm not the only one who has raised this concern. A number of maintainers have. And this is a problem actually throughout the free software community. It's not just something that's in the kernel community, but you do definitely see it there. And
that's one concern.
Yeah, that's one concern. I'm not quite sure what to do about that. One could worry about this old cadre of maintainers. At some point they will retire and they'll take a lot of experience with them. I worry about that. I worry about the increasing interest in other kernels, things like Zephyr or Fuchsia or things like that are being developed specifically to be permissively licensed kernels that are perhaps much more amenable to control by one or a very small number of companies. And some of those I think could push Linux aside in various, at least in various subfields. I think Linux is pretty unassailable in some areas, but it is definitely not in others. And I think that some of the corporate community has lost sight of what it was that made Linux as great as it is, and would like to go back to something that's a little bit more under a given company's control. And that may be short-term useful, and I think is long-term not going to be good for anybody involved.
Because they say, it's on GitHub. Every time you talk, it's on GitHub, or we are fully open source. But you're totally right. It is on GitHub, but because of the license, you control it. What other concerns do you have?
What other concerns? I believe that the kernel, like many other development communities, suffers from chronic underinvestment in aspects of it. We have 200 companies or so contributing to every single kernel release. So a lot of this, what you see is that companies have become very fond of contributing support to the kernel to make sure that their own hardware works very well with the kernel. And this is a great thing. We're glad. We've been asking them to do it for years. They are doing it. This is a great thing. But there's a whole lot of the kernel that is more part of the core kernel that everybody needs. There's the memory management subsystem. There's the virtual file system layer. There are whole parts of the kernel that aren't really tied to any one company's hardware or such. And it can be harder to find companies that are willing to support that. Some of the companies that contribute to the most code to the kernel do not contribute to the core kernel at all. And I've given some of them some real grief about that. We see areas like security. Security has been chronically underinvested in the kernel. It's getting better now. My own pet area, of course, is documentation, and nobody wants to pay. There is nobody whose job it is to write documentation for the kernel. Nobody at all. And it really shows in the quality of our documentation. So some of those areas, I think, are really going to hurt us going forward. We need to get better investment there.
When you mentioned documentation, and since you're a writer, I am a writer, one thing I also worry about is that when you said that all these top maintainers as they age they may go away with their experience, is there any mechanism within the kernel community where either there is a step-by-step processes what they should follow or best practices, or they have documented their own how you should get involved with the kernel or not?
We have documentation in the kernel for those lines. There's a whole development process document that I wrote actually with support from the Linux Foundation that describes how the development community works and how to be a part of it. So that exists. There's a whole lot of other documentation on how to submit patches and make sure they get through. There is work just getting started now. We're trying to create a manual for maintainers and how to be a subsystem maintainer in the kernel, because that is thoroughly undocumented at this point. And we think that needs to change. So we have some of it. We would like to add more.
Today, everybody is using open source. Almost everybody is using, but most of those companies or organizations, they don't understand how open source work. They throw a lot of packages with different licenses together, which may create some licensing violation issues. Or from the kernel community's perspective, how big is that a concern?
If you're talking about the code that's in the kernel itself, I think we have a pretty good story there. I'm not too concerned about that. The lawsuits from the SCO group brought a lot of attention to kernel source licensing and the provenance of kernel code as well. And at that time, it was found that we really had no problems there. They found like one function that had been taken from an old version of Unix, and that had already been removed from the kernel before they found it, that sort of thing. So we were in good shape to begin with, and we tightened up our procedures quite a bit after that. So I don't think we have trouble with license violations in the kernel. We had a couple of issues in the documentation with stuff under the free documentation license, which is not a GPL compatible license. And for various reasons, the kernel's documentation needs to be GPL compatible, even though you don't necessarily think of it as source code. And so we fixed that. So I'm not really too concerned about that. If you're talking about compliance with the kernel's license in the wider community, there's of course all kinds of well-known problems around that. And that's an issue we could talk about for a long time in its own right.
Now let's just lighten the whole mood before we wrap up this interview. What do you do in your free time, if you have any free time, beyond dealing with kernels?
And what is this free time thing of which you speak? I mean, what do I do in my free time? I mean, I live in the mountains. I like going up into the mountains. I travel. I ride my bicycle a lot. That sort of thing. I still raise my kids, even though my kids are out of the house now, that sort of thing, and in general try to be a part of my community. And
you came back to the community again. Are you talking about the local community or the kernel community?
No, I'm talking the local community.
Local community. Okay. Do you do scuba diving like Linus, or go on the jet planes?
Scuba diving opportunities in Colorado are
okay. You're right.
Are relatively scarce. So
yeah, maybe skydiving.
That you can do, but I don't do that. Like you said, I like to walk in the mountains and ride my bike.
Safe and quiet.
And that sort of thing, yes.
Anything else you would like to say before we wrap up this interview?
Not much, I would say. I mean, it's been a pleasure, and I don't know. I mean, the free software community has certainly been one of the best things that has ever happened to me. I'm glad to be a part of it and look forward to continuing to help to make it grow.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you.